good afternoon, and welcome to Making the Most Out of Your Grant Application. My name is Edward Caldwell, and I have the honor of facilitating this workshop with Christy Ingram, Gina Ortiz, and Margie Shepard. You have the opportunity to hear from them later in the workshop. First, a reminder that everyone has been muted to cut down on background noise. If you have any questions or comments, please enter them into the chat. Also, remember to select all participants in the chat for comments intended for everyone. During the workshop, we will ask questions, and if you can, please share your thoughts and ideas through the chat. Today's session will be recorded and made available for future viewing on our YouTube channel. The speaker slides and resource guide has been made available as a PDF, and the links will be placed into the chat. If you need captioning, please click on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen to access the closed captioning. And also, please click Show Subtitle. Last but not least, we will be conducting a survey at the end of the session. So we would like to ask everyone to stay logged in until after we have conducted our survey. Before we get started, we would like to see who's joining us today for the workshop. If you can, please say hello and enter your state in the chat. I see we have friends joining us from Louisiana, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we get into our workshop today, here's a little history about the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency. Many of you might be more familiar with the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the many institutes and centers at NIH. The National Library of Medicine is the world's largest biomedical library, which maintains and makes available vast print collections and produces electronic information resources like Medline Plus and PubMed. NNLM is a network of the National Library of Medicine and is an outreach program of NLM. The NNLM is made up of 7 geographic regions. We are from Region 3, which serves Arkansas, Louisiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. And our office is located at the University of North Texas Health Science Center at Fort Worth. At NNLM, our mission is to provide equal access to biomedical information to health professionals, as well as access to quality health information for the general public so they are better able to make informed decisions about their health. We do this through resources on our website, funding of projects, webinars, and in-person trainings just like this one. Over the next few hours, we will discuss grants available, including those from NNLM Region 3, explain the different sections of a grant application, identify documents to include with the grant proposal, describe elements of the budget proposal, and identify common mistakes made by proposal writers. Where do you look for grant money? If you can share one resource, please do so in the chat. And I will give everyone some time to think about that question. And the question is, where do you look for grant money? And that can be local, it can be with federal, wherever you will look for grant funding when applying for a grant application. I see grants.gov, local foundation, PCORI. The foundation directory. Thank you all for showing, and we are grateful that you shared those resources with us. They are all excellent, and we will elaborate on some of them. To write a successful grant proposal, you need to identify the funding source for your project. This will give you the information you need to write your application. The first resource we would like to highlight is the network of the National Library of Medicine. A membership in the network of the National Library of Medicine is completely free and easy to join. When you join, you have access to funding opportunities, professional development, training, and more. If you have any questions on becoming a member, we can help you join our region or a region that's near you. Once you join our network, you will have access to our open funding opportunities. Being a member allows you to sort through open funding opportunities from our regions and to see national funding opportunities from programs like the All of Us program. Please make sure you select the region you're in to find the open funding opportunities that's best for you. If you are in Region 3, you can also see our open funding opportunities and more on the Gibson D. Lewis Library page. Let's take a look at what's available on our additional page. I really like our website because it's simple and easy to navigate. We have news, information about our office, open funding opportunities, how to join us for our monthly webinar called Health Bites, which, by the way, will take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central Time. We will be discussing the use of podcasts to reduce misinformation in the time of COVID-19, a collaboration of librarians, healthcare providers, and community organizations. You can also find our newsletter and see a complete list of the awesome individuals in our office on our website. If you click on open funding opportunities, you will see what's available in our region. We have funding opportunities available throughout the year, from outreach awards, exhibit awards, and professional development opportunities. Our newest Tribal Health Award provides supports for projects that improve health information literacy and increase the ability of American Indian communities and individuals in tribal nations to find and use health information. Occasionally, reading grants can be confusing, so we want to eliminate any uncertainty when applying for grants. You should carefully read the announcement, and if there is any confusion in the application, please contact us. We want to make sure that you have a positive grant experience, so we are here to help. Having no idea what the language or lingo of a grant means can be a barrier. If you don't know the language, don't worry. There are free resources to help. NIH is a great place to locate funds, but it's a great place full of free resources. NIH have a glossary and acronym guide that will help you understand any word in a grant. Some of the most common grant acronyms are RFPs, RFAs, CFAs, FOAs, PAs, letter of intent, and letter of application. What do these terms mean? Using the NIH glossary, let's describe some grant lingo. RFP, or Request for Proposal, announces that NIH would like to award a contract to a certain need. RFA, or Request for Application, is a formal statement that solicits grant or cooperative agreement application in a well-defined scientific area to accomplish program objectives. FOA, or a funding opportunity announcement, is a publicly available document by which a federal agency makes known its intention to award discretionary grants or cooperative agreements, usually as a result of competition for funds. LOI, or letter of intent, usually includes the name, address, and phone number of the private investigator, identifies other key personnel and participating institution in a request for application or program announcement identification. It is everyone's dream to receive grants over $1 million. In reality, smaller grants can have just as much of an impact on the community as larger ones. When you start small, you gain the confidence and credibility you need to apply for larger grants in the future. The first place I would look for funding is with the government. Grants.gov is an excellent resource for finding funding. A few examples of government funding are the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institutes of Health, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Health Resources and Service Administration, and the network of the National Library of Medicine. Look for funding opportunities outside the government websites through foundations. There are various types of foundations with different priorities and funding requirements. However, there are over 3,000 foundations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that offer grant funding opportunities to the community. Please make sure you check your communities for foundations that are offering funding through grants. There are grants available for small businesses. Start by looking for small business grants on the U.S. for Small Business Association website. Associations list funding opportunities throughout the country on their websites, and you may find grants that will allow you to attend their conferences. For university staff, there may be grants available from within your institution. That's great, but if you haven't had any luck with those, open your search to other grant funders. If any of you are at a university, universities often have subscriptions to databases to search for funders like Pivot. The Foundation Center and GuideStar combined forces and are now called Candid. Candid.org has a database where you can search for grants, but there is usually a cost for subscribing to the database. However, there are libraries, community foundations, and other nonprofit resource centers located across the US and several countries. These locations are paying or have partnered with the foundation to offer access to the database to their patrons. Candid provides free funding information through these 400 funding information network locations. Use this map to find a network location near you. The Grants.gov Program Management Office was established in 2002 as a part of the President's Management Agenda. Managed by the Department of Health and Human Services, Grants.gov is an e-government initiative operating under the governance of the Office of Management and Budget. Today, the Grants.gov system houses information on over 1,000 grant programs and vets grant applications for federal grant-making agencies. The mission of the Institute of Museum and Library Services is to advance, support, and empower America's museums, libraries, and related organizations through grant-making, research, and policy development. In 2020, they awarded over $200 million in funding. When applying for government grants, here are some things you should remember. Government grants require an application, and they are always for a purpose. Government agency will never call, text, message you on social media, or email to ask for your social security, bank account, or credit card number. In fact, no matter who they say they are, don't give out their information. Once a scammer has your information, they can steal money from your account or your identity. The only place you can find a list of all available federal grants is at grants.gov, and that list is free. No government agency will ever contact you to demand that you pay to get a grant, and no government agency will ever ask you to pay with a gift card, cash reload card, by money transfer, or with cryptocurrency, not for a grant and not ever. After you have identified what agency you would like to apply for funding, you want to make sure you know what the agency is asking for in the grant proposal. Next, Margaret will explain the different sections of a grant application in our office. However, these steps can be applied to almost any grant application.
Thanks, Edward, for that great intro to grants. So next, as Edward mentioned, we're going to explore what to do when looking for funding and discuss the different parts of a grant proposal application. Next slide. So to get you thinking about funding, we're going to do another exercise in the chat, because what we want to do as your presenters is to understand where you're coming from. So we want to get an idea about what you think when you hear the words grant proposal. So for instance, if I say NNLM Region 3 has funding available and we are accepting grant proposals right now, what do you think about? So we would like to see what those words mean to you. So please put your answers in the chat. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about it, to add your thoughts. And again, if you don't want to add your thoughts in the chat, that's just fine. But think about it as we go forward with this presentation. Okay. We're getting some really great responses. Let's see. Writing, that's a good one. Making change, that's really excellent. Does anybody think of I'm scared, or does anybody think of I don't want to do it? Or maybe oh, project development, I like that. Yeah. Writing, making change. How about show me the money? Something like that. Okay, just a few more seconds for everybody to throw some things in there. Okay. All right. Well, I really appreciate you, those of you that threw those in there, because it really does help us. Yeah, scared and overwhelmed. Yeah. Good. Good. That's the way I felt the first grant I wrote too. So next slide, Edward. So as I said before, those are all really, really great answers. So the point is, so if you're feeling unsure or you're confused, or maybe you're a seasoned proposal writer, we want you to be better equipped to seek opportunities for funding. So when we talk about a grant proposal, it's all of those things that you mentioned in the chat. It's writing, it's scary, etc. But officially, it's a very clear, direct document written to a particular organization or funding agency with the purpose of persuading the reviewers to provide you with support, because you have a really important and fully considered plan to advance a very valuable cause, and you are responsible and capable of realizing that plan. So most staff members in nonprofit organizations define a grant proposal as a request for money. However, that definition is only superficially correct. So to achieve the best results for your community and the project focus group, nonprofits need to think about grants in a different way. So first, I want you to consider the grant from the funder's point of view. For funders, a grant award is an investment in positive change. It's a tool that we use or others use for having an impact on issues that we or they care about. So next, consider grants from a mission-focused perspective. Since the point of a grant award is impact rather than money, the real point of a grant proposal is to rally the necessary resources to help nonprofits fill the purpose. And a grant is another tool that nonprofits use to address important issues within their communities. And finally, definitions do matter. So defining grant proposals accurately can help both funders and nonprofits work together more productively. You know, a grant proposal is actually a call to action. So it's a request to the funder, join a nonprofit as a partner in achieving specific results. And at its best, a grant proposal is a cogent, persuasive, well-supported argument for change. Next slide. So now that we know what a grant proposal is, there's a few things you should consider before you start putting the pen to paper. First, you want to make sure that you prepare. You want to develop a specific, meaningful, actionable plan for what you want to do and why you want to do it. And you want to consider how that plan is going to achieve positive results. And this might be in the way that you evaluate your plan as you're putting it forth. The next, you want to define your fundraising goals. So are you looking for funding that's 100% from a grant, or do you have other sources of funding for the project? Are there community partners with the same mission that you have that could provide some support for a part of the funding that's mentioned in the proposal? And third, you really need to estimate your costs. Christy will be covering the budget in greater detail later, but you should have a general idea of what the project will cost to implement. You want to include costs such as materials, labor, travel, etc. when you're coming up with an estimate. And you also want to consider how you plan to sustain the project if that is a goal or objective. And the next thing you want to do is create a timeline. So this is really helpful in helping you manage all those activities from the pre-award phase through the award phase to the post-award wrap-up phase. Now you're finally ready to look for some prospective grants. So using the resources that Edward mentioned or some that you may know of yourself, you're going to locate granting organizations or sources that fund projects very similar to the one that you have in mind. And you want to do some research for potential grants once you find ones that fit. You want to look at the organization and make sure that its mission aligns with your plan. And then review the organization's proposal guidelines. And finally, I want to encourage you to find some examples to look at. Check out some sample proposals that were successful in getting an award from an institution. Or so, for instance, maybe with your own institution, you know, people that have been successful, you might have peers that work elsewhere or other organizations in your community. These can really come in handy. Next slide, please. And a really great way to get organized when you're starting this process is to develop a checklist. Here's an example of a checklist that can be found on the grants.gov website that Edward mentioned. It's a list of steps to help you get started when you're applying for federal grants, but it can really be adapted for any application process. So we've included a link to this in our resource guides if you're interested in using it and adapting it for your own use. So, but no matter what you decide to use, I really highly recommend that you have a checklist to keep you on track. For me, there's something really satisfying about checking boxes off. It really makes me feel like I'm accomplishing something. Next slide, please. All right, so I mentioned researching the funder earlier. However, there's a little bit more to grant researching than just that. First, you need to know what you need. So before you even begin the grant researching process, it's a really good idea to look at your organization and determine what you need. While you don't have to pay any funds back with grants, the majority of funders want you to tell them exactly how you plan to use their money and the specific ways you plan to spend it. As you get into fleshing out your research process, you'll need to know the answer to that question. Next, you want to narrow down your list. Knowing what you need also helps you cut down the list to the grants that specifically fit your needs. You know, applying for grants can be long and sometimes tedious process. So it might be appealing to have dozens of grants to apply to, but in reality, you want to have a short list of just a handful where you think you have the best chance of being awarded funding. Next, you can begin your search. Once you have completed steps 1 and 2, you can really start that search in earnest. With your funding needs and criteria set, you'll have a much easier time determining which grants should be added to your list or ignored. And keep in mind that this process can take you a little while, so plan for it. And as you learn about funding opportunities, you might consider setting up a calendar on a biannual basis or quarterly basis so you don't miss any new grants throughout the year. And one thing to really pay attention to, and that's details. So most grants have all sorts of qualifications and requirements, both for applying and for spending the funds. And these aren't merely suggestions, but they're an essential part of the grant process. So if you miss any of these, you may have to resubmit your proposal or be disqualified entirely. And we don't really ever want to see that. So please do keep track of any particular requirements or qualifications that stand out or are unique for the specific grant. Next slide. So here are some best practices for you to consider. Keep track. As soon as you start digging into the grant funding process, you will quickly learn that there are a lot of dates, not to mention paperwork to keep an eye on. So your best bet is to develop some sort of system that allows you to keep track of the important deadlines. Determine what works best for you. It could be a spreadsheet, maybe it's a calendar, or maybe you like using project management tools. Once you decide, just make sure you get everything you need on it. You want to create a grant library too. So I know that you probably will have spent lots of time researching opportunities that are available. So don't let that newfound information go to waste. You know, compile a list of things that you've learned in one place for future reference. You know, it may come in handy. You might have a project that comes up that is a perfect fit for one of those opportunities that you've discovered. And build a template for applications. So this is a true story. You know, I've reviewed quite a few grants, and one of the things that always strikes me as a little troublesome is when I'm reading along and all of a sudden I stumble onto something, for instance, where the organization is misnamed, or there's parentheses where key information is missing. So, you know, it tells me that somebody cut and pasted this particular information into our application or the application I'm reviewing. And, you know, that's something that kind of makes me raise my eyebrows. So if there's one thing that you want to avoid, it's copying and pasting your entire grant proposal and submitting the same thing to all your prospective funders. So, however, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be some really great elements or sections that are essentially reusable or replicatable, whatever. So with a little bit of tweaking. So if you create a template, for grant proposal document you can build off of. It's really easier when you apply. And next, establish a network. So if your organization is looking for local or community grants, check in with those past winners and applicants and ask about their experience when they applied for the grant. You're probably going to learn a lot of really great tips and tricks that you might not have otherwise considered that can help strengthen your application. And finally, know your needs. I mentioned this earlier, but it does deserve repeating. Look at your organization first and know how much funding you need, what you need it for, and how you plan to spend it. That can help you immediately research with a much more targeted list of granting organizations. Next slide. And initiate contact. I can't stress this enough. So if you have questions, don't ever hesitate to call up a funding organization or send an email to ask for clarification, or just drop, if you have an idea or a project that you want to bounce off anyone in that organization, please do that. I think that's one of the things that we all enjoy, is getting to know people and helping them realize their dream projects. Those of us in Region 3, we all love to discuss project, and I know so do the other coordinators in the other 6 regions. So please don't be afraid to reach out. We love to award funding and serve as liaisons and see your project come to life. Next slide. Okay, so you've found the right grant for your organization's need. You've done the planning. You're ready to begin the steps for submitting a proposal. Now what? Well, one of the first things you should take is to get familiar with the award you decide to apply for. So the next section, I'm going to be specifically presenting with NNLM grants in mind, but this information is typical for most applications. So in the case of NNLM grants, this information will be found in the request for proposal, or RFP, or the FOA, whichever term that you prefer to use. So within this document, you will find all of the information about the award and what you need to provide in the proposal to get the funding. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at each section. Next slide. So the first section in most awards is the funding information. Here's where you will find important details about the award, such as the performance period. So this lists the dates for the beginning and ending of the project performance period, or when you can actually start the project and when it needs to be wrapped up. The amount is where you can find the maximum amount of funding for the award. However, I want to point out that for our awards, you can certainly ask for less if your project fits the criteria. And then the number of awards available. Sometimes there are multiple awards available versus just one. And the application deadline. Some applications have a hard deadline, but some awards are ongoing, such as professional development awards. So just to make sure that you're aware of that deadline. Next slide. So this section, the description of the award, describes all the different elements, such as the mission of the funder. So this is where you're going to learn all about who is providing the funds. This may include a mission, a vision, and information about the goals and objectives the funder has for the work that they do. In the case of NNLM, the main goals are to work through libraries and other members to support a highly trained workforce for biomedical and health information resources and data, et cetera, et cetera. So I suggest taking a deeper look, though, at the organization you're thinking of submitting a proposal to. You're going to find much more if you do a little digging. And it's important to make sure that the mission and vision and goals of the organization align with your organizations. So this is especially important if you need to gain support from a board or administration before applying. The primary aims of the award. In this section, you'll find out if the project you have in mind aligns with specific aims of the organization. So for instance, the primary aims of awards offered by NNLM regional medical libraries are to widen access to and awareness of health information resources, with the focus on those resources provided by NNLM. So just make sure that your project fits in the aims. And the purpose of the award. So this section gives you the reasons the award is being offered. So for instance, our Health Information Outreach Award that's being offered in the coming year, provide support for projects that improve health information, literacy, and increase the ability of consumers, caregivers, students, and other members of the public to find and use health information. So bear in mind, though, that is kind of while it seems specific, can be kind of vague. So this can cover a wide range of potential projects. So be creative. Next slide. So all applications provide information about what is required when submitting a proposal. So take a close look at what is needed and make sure you address the requirements in the proposal. So for instance, NNLM awards require one or more NLM resources to be included in the project. So this can be the use of materials found in NLM resources for teaching purposes, to build a toolkit, or to impart health information. The preference section refers to what the funder will be looking for when reviewing the proposal. This usually refers to increasing information access, maybe prioritizing underrepresented populations and geographic locations that are typically underserved, and other demographics that contribute to unequal access to health information. And there may be some unique parts to each award, so just make sure you're aware of that. The next slide, please. Okay, so some RFPs include some project ideas, and our NLM awards usually do. So these could be based on previously funded projects, and they are there to help you get ideas to add to your project, or maybe to help you if you're looking for something that you need to add to a project idea. That's why we include those. And the next slide. The eligibility requirements. So it's really important to determine whether you are eligible to apply for and receive a federal grant, or any grant for that matter. This is a really important piece of the equation. So if you're not legally eligible for a specific funded opportunity, and you would waste a whole lot of time and effort completing the application process when you can't actually receive the grant. In the case of NNLM grants, the organization must be a network member and be located in the region offering the funding. The exception is all of us funding opportunities that are promoted throughout all 7 regions. And regarding projects that conduct research, some regions may require special documentation if research is going to take place. And I do need to mention that NNLM grants do not apply to research using human subjects. So just make sure your organization fits the eligibility requirements by reading this section carefully. Next slide. So here are a few do's and don'ts to think about. Do your research, read the entire request for proposal, create a timeline, reach out to the funder with questions, and above all, don't give up. Next slide. So beyond the application overview, NNLM grants provide a section called additional information. So here you can find grant writing resources, 508 compliance requirements, reporting requirements, application review, and scoring criteria. This will tell you how the actual proposal is scored. So I appreciate your attention, and now I'm going to pass this over to Jen, who will take you through the application overview.
Thank you very much. So now you've looked at all these grants and you've done your research about everything that's available, and you found one or more that seem perfect for you or your team to apply for. So you may have already done this, and I hope you have, but you're going to want to read over the entire request and see what is required of you. Depending on your organization, you may need to speak to other departments to get certain information or approval, and it could take a while. So even if you were a pro at pulling all-nighters in college and turning in papers on time, you're not going to be able to do that with most grant applications. Writing a grant application is similar to applying for a job. You think you're a perfect fit, but you have just a small amount of space to explain how your background and experience are a great match for this opportunity. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to assume that the grant you're applying for is from the NNLM, and I'll speak specifically about our requirements, but a lot of this information is general and would work for any grant that you'd be applying for. Next slide, please. Okay, so to get started on your application, you're going to want to read over that request, and you're going to notice we keep telling you to read over the full request because we've seen people who have not done this. But you're going to want to find out what's required of you. And so I recommend, grab a cup of coffee or tea and block out some time to make that list of everything that you're going to need. So some of the elements will be created by you. Some are forms that need to be completed, and others may require you to get documents from your colleagues or your partners. You'll want to have all of these documents together so that you can send them in one email. So although I did say to submit them in one email, if you're applying for a Region 3 grant, there'll need to be separate attachments within the email. And so again, there's a lot of details about how we want things submitted. So you want to make sure you've read over that clearly and made a note of it. So here are a few elements of the application checklist when you apply, and you'll notice that some of these are, say, optional or if applicable. So take a look at these now to see if you'll need these for your application. And I'll go over most of these in more detail in a bit. Budgets are a very important part of the process, and my colleague Christy is going to speak more on that specifically in a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and briefly mention number 6. Which Margie also mentioned as well, that the RML, or Regional Medical Library, does not fund projects that involve human subjects research. So some organizations may have an institutional review board or IRB that can generate a letter that shows that your project does not meet the definitions of human subjects research. But you can always speak with your organization, or again, reach out to us if you have any questions about anything before you apply or as you're applying. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's start with the full project proposal and what that consists of. So the first page is going to be your project information. So this is just one page to give us the basic information of your proposal. It's essentially the cover sheet or the cover letter for your proposal. We're going to ask for the lead organization. So while several organizations may be working together on the grant, our office will be contracting with one organization that will be responsible for submitting invoices and being reimbursed. And Christy's going to cover that in more detail, but we want to know who will be the lead organization. And of course, this organization will need to be an NNLM member organization. Then we want to know who the project lead is. So several people may be working to write this proposal, working together, and I highly suggest that you do gather a team to do this, but we want the name of one contact person, especially if we have questions or we need to speak with you about possible changes to make the grant fundable. And then this, you've got your institution tax ID, and then also your institutional DUNS number. But be very careful, because beginning in 2022, the institutional DUNS number is actually changing, and you will need a unique entity identifier, or SAM, created in sam.gov instead of the DUNS number. And you'll find more information about this in the resource guide that we've provided. Since all of our projects and the applications begin in 2022, you'll need this new information on the application. So again, if you've cut and pasted information in the past, this isn't going to work, because we're going to need a new SAM ID. So you'll want to speak out or reach out to the person in your organization who will be responsible for creating this. And depending on how large your organization is, it could take some time to identify the correct person and make sure that this has been created. So I suggest that you start working on this now. And as I said, more information on this and how to apply and how to find out what it is available in our grant writing resource. Another thing that we'll ask for NNLM grants is if you've applied for funding in the current grant cycle, which began on May 1st, 2021. And if you're not sure, again, reach out to us, call us, email us. We can look up your information and let you know. The final thing that's going to go on the project information page is the total amount that you're requesting. So we have grants for several different amounts. And if you only need $24,999 instead of the full $25,000 that's available for a particular grant, this is where you'd let us know. Make sure that the amount you're requesting does not exceed the amount available for the particular grant that you're applying for. You know, we have some grants that are $2,000, $8,000, $25,000. So we probably have a grant in the amount that you need. You just need to make sure you're applying for that one. And it's also very important to make sure that the amount that you put on your project information page matches up with the amount listed both in your budget and your budget narrative. It should be the same number throughout. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we get into the fun parts of your project narrative. So for our grants, the project narrative will not exceed 10 pages. So you may have additional documents, but the actual narrative itself will not exceed 10 pages. So first, you'll want to give us the title of your project. And the title is how our office will refer to your project, and then how it will be listed on our website if it is funded. So make sure that that's how you'd like to be referred to. So think of it as the title of your book. So you may have a working title as you're writing the proposal, but make sure what you send us is ready for the cover, because you'll be dealing with us a lot if you get funded, and you will hear this name over and over again. So make sure it's something that you want to be known by. We also ask for a 1-paragraph project summary. And this summary will be listed on the NNLM website and will be what others see when they look up past funded grants. So make sure it covers the highlights of your project, but again, just in 1 paragraph. You'll also list up to 3 partner organizations. And the NNLM member directory is a great place to find other organizations in your area that you may want to partner with. So I'd suggest looking at that now so that you're not trying to make connections in the days before the proposal is due. And I'll talk more about this as we cover letters of support at the end of the application. We also ask if you're providing training as part of this award, and this is just a simple yes or no answer. And we'll also ask for the start and end dates of your project. So our year 2 awards are from June 1st, 2022 to April 30th, 2023. If your project will be completed sooner than that, that's fine. Just let us know. And if you're working on a longer project, be aware that we cannot fund activities that occur after our project year. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, and so now we're getting into the narrative. We're going to get more details. And so this is where you tell us the story of what you want to do, why it's important, and how you will measure the impact of your project. And remember that this proposal will be read by people who aren't familiar with your community or your organization. So make sure not to use any jargon or acronyms that would be unfamiliar to people outside your organization. And NNLM staff have diverse backgrounds, so you want to provide details. If in doubt, give more information. If you provide statistics on your community, such as demographic information, please provide the sources. And this information will also be used to help you fill out the direct beneficiaries checklist, which we also require as one of our part of our grants. And that's where you're going to tell us who your project is focused on. Are you planning to reach out to children, senior citizens, health professionals, or any number of the people that we're trying to reach in our grants? And ideally, this should be clear to anyone reading the narrative, but you'll also specify it on the form. And so if you're rural and medical providers are more than 3 hours away, that's a great thing to mention on your application. Tell us the story of your community. Because I'll admit, I grew up in Atlanta, I live in DFW. What I think of as rural is very different from what people who actually live in rural communities tell me about. And so please tell us the story so we know what's happening in your community. And you'll want to tell us your project goals and objectives. So you're asking for money to do something. And so you want to make sure that the goals line up with the goals of the grant that you're applying for, and that you tell us why there's a clear need for this in your community, what you plan to accomplish. And what are you going to do to meet these objectives? What are the major tasks and who is responsible for them? And There shouldn't be any surprises like in the application, especially when we get to the budget and to the narrative. So if we've been reading about an in-person program and then we see $10,000 in the budget for laptops with no mention of what they'll be used for, like that can be confusing. And be explicit and specific. So if you're asking for $20,000 for a telehealth kiosk, that doesn't tell us exactly what you're trying to purchase. If it's a pre-made kiosk with all the technology, or are you purchasing computers and webcams and medical equipment, and you're making your own kiosk? Give us specifics. If you have a link to a particular item you're planning to buy, like that can be helpful, just so that we understand what you're talking about. And we know that things change and that particular model may not be available, or things may, your project may change slightly. So you're not locking yourself into that purchase, but it helps us to get an idea of what you're planning with your project. You also want to include a schedule or a timeline for implementing your plan, and be realistic in your estimate. We want you to be successful and not stressed trying to complete so many tasks very quickly. And I recommend a logic model to determine your goals and the actions you'll need to take to accomplish them. And if you're not familiar with logic models, check out the grant writing resources document, where we've linked to some evaluation resources from the NNLM, including, for those of you who haven't used these before, or maybe you have and you're not a huge fan, we have a tier list logic model that will walk you through the process. And then also, like, how will you know if your project is successful? You'll need some sort of evaluation plan. Are you counting attendance, completing surveys? What is the goal of your project, and how are you going to measure it? If funded, you'll need to discuss the success of the project and what could have been improved or changed. So you'll want to think this through before you begin the project. A great resource for those of you in public or academic libraries is Project Outcome, which is a free resource from the American Library Association. It helps share the impact of library services and programs by providing simple surveys and an easy-to-use process for measuring and evaluating outcomes. One of their service areas is health, so this is a great resource to look into to see possible survey questions or other ways to evaluate your programs. And this source has also been put into the resource document. And of course, publicity, promotion. How will your community, especially your target audience, know what you're doing? How are you promoting to your audience? Will you be using social media, flyers, TV ads, word of mouth? You don't want to put effort into a project that nobody attends. I worked in a library, I've had that happen, and it's so disappointing. So you don't want to do that with this. So if your project is targeting people with low technology skills or an area of the state that doesn't have high-speed internet, then an online campaign is probably not the best use of your time and resources. And this is also the section where you'll want to mention the specific NLM resources that you plan to use in the project. One of NLM's goals is to improve individuals' access to information to allow them to improve their health. So it is important to us that NLM resources are an important part of the project and not an afterthought. And then also, will the project be ongoing? So if so, how will it be staffed or funded? So remember, NLM funds can only be used for the grant year funded, which means that funding for these projects will need to be used before April 30th, 2023. If the supplies purchased can continue to be used and you have staff available through partnerships to continue the project without additional funding, let us know. And then the last section will discuss personnel qualifications. So you'll mention the staff being involved in the project from your organization and any other partner organizations, and describe their roles and experience. You'll want to mention how much of their time you anticipate being used on the project, even if you're not asking for their salaries or wages to come from the grant. And so if you're from an academic institution, you may have pages-long CVs for each of your staff. On the other hand, you may have a staff person who's been with your organization so long that they don't have an up-to-date resume. Have them create one showing their history with your organization and show how their experience fits in with the roles they'll be taking on in the project. This doesn't need to be fancy. This isn't used to show off degrees, but for reviewers to have an idea why these staff are the ones that are best suited for this project. If you have a longtime volunteer working on the project, that's fine. You choose your team. You just have to briefly tell us why they were picked. Okay, and next, please. And so as you're writing your narrative, you're telling the reviewers what you plan to accomplish with this project. And you want to keep in mind, for most awards, especially including ours, you'll be asked to write reports detailing the actions you took on your project and how successful you were. That means that now is the time to determine what success means to you. Will that be the number of participants attending a class, a percentage increase in knowledge with pre and post surveys, or something else? This is really dependent on the type of project you're undertaking. But you need to figure out now what you'll measure and how you'll do that. And keep in mind that a final project report will be due. Our success is determined by the success of our subawardees, and we won't know if you've been successful if you're not sure what you're going to measure. And each community and project is different. So success could be the number of people attending a program, a certain number of podcasts downloaded, or perhaps the number of steps your participants tracked during a program. Be specific. Great attendance could be 5 attendees or 500. Have a plan for measuring and keep it realistic. If your project will have small attendance numbers because you're focusing on increasing knowledge among attendees, that's fine. Just be sure to tell us what you're doing and why. Next slide, please. And if you listed other organizations that you'll be partnering with, see if you can get somebody from that organization to write a letter of support. If they've worked with you on previous projects or are familiar with your work, this is helpful to mention. If they describe what they'll be doing in the project, it's clear that they're up for the challenge if the grant is awarded. Even if they haven't worked with you before, a letter sharing their enthusiasm for the project can go a long way. Just a few sentences from the other organizations let us know that they're ready and willing to take on this project. Everyone is busy, so make sure that you allow plenty of time for your partners to have the opportunity to improve your application. And remember, if they're a significant part of the project, you'll also want to make sure that you've gotten their updated resumes as well. Next, please. And then I know we've been mentioning it, but it's so important that I'm going to mention it again. Have someone else read over your proposal before you send it in. Make sure names are spelled correctly, any acronyms are spelled out, and then any statistics are cited. 2 years ago, the NNLM changed its name, but not our initials. And we received several proposals, even a few years later, that referred to us by the old name. Make sure you've downloaded and filled out all of the forms, even if you've applied in the past. Sometimes these look very familiar and you may think they're the same, but they've been updated and reviewers will notice if you've simply attached an old form. Next, please. Okay, down to the tips and tricks. So as I mentioned earlier, begin working on your application early. You don't want to rush through it, and being able to put it aside and look at it with fresh eyes can do great things for you. As with most things, you get better with practice, so apply for grants throughout the year. If a cover letter is requested, make sure that it's included. Make sure that all of the questions in the application have been answered. When you've had others read over your proposal, have they had any questions for you? Those might be the same questions the reviewers would have, so go ahead and address those before you submit. This is even more important if you've been writing this grant by yourself. You know what you want to do so clearly that you may forget to add details that would help everyone else understand what you plan to accomplish and how. Next slide, please. And make sure you followed all of the guidelines. If you're told what font and spacing to use, make sure you use that format. You don't want to miss out on funding because you use Calibri instead of Times New Roman. And be specific. What are you trying to solve or improve? What are your objectives and what results are you expecting? If you were to go on vacation when this project is scheduled to start, would your colleagues know what to do? So if you're creating a wellness program and you plan to provide pedometers to participants to track their steps along with handouts on exercise from Medline Plus, mention those details. If you say instead that you're going to hand out bags of info and goodies, the reviewers start to think about what is and isn't fundable in their grants. And be realistic. It's better to under-promise and over-deliver. You know what your organization is capable of, and you don't want to receive a grant and find yourself struggling to do the work. And lastly, if you're not funded the first time you apply, don't feel dejected. With all of our applications, we will provide you with feedback on both the positive aspects of your application and what we feel could be stronger or what we had questions on. Take that information to create a stronger application the next time and reapply. That shows us that you feel strongly enough about your project to try again. And I know all of this sounds overwhelming, but we really do want to fund you in your projects. We love to see people's dreams come true and their, people in their communities having a great time. And so don't be afraid to apply and to ask for help. We're here for you. Our individual contact information will be at the end of the presentation, and feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions, either before you apply or while you're in the application process. Edward, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Jen. I think this would be a great time to reflect on what we learned so far. So far, we have discussed grants available from different trustworthy institutions, how to apply for grant funding through the network of the National Library of Medicine. We explained the different sections of our grant application and identified what documents to include in your grant proposal. Let's use the next 5 minutes to get a snack, use the restroom, and answer any lingering emails. We will see you back at 3:01 to cover the elements of your proposal, your budget proposal, and identifying common mistakes made by proposal writers. The next voice you will hear is Christy Ingram.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. I hope you can hear me just fine. Just give people a couple more seconds just to trickle back in and get back to their computers and get their snacks ready. So, like I said, welcome back everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for our grant presentation. Again, my name is Christy Ingram and I am the grant manager for Region 3 Medical Library. I do specialize in pre-award, post-award, and compliance for grant budgets and grant management in general. And for budget building, I think this section decides whether you are one of two types of people in this world: the person who sees the budget and cringes a little inside, or the person that says, yay, math. I am kind of a mix between the two, which is an anomaly, but don't worry, with budget building, there's a little bit of something for everybody, all the way from writing a justification to doing the mathematic juggling that we call budgeting. So of course, in all seriousness, budget building doesn't have to be a scary process. And hopefully today I can give you some takeaway points and some knowledge, tips, and tricks that will help give you the confidence to approach this very important aspect of the grant application process. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so let's take a look at some of the things we're going to tackle today. Budget terminology. What are some common words, acronyms, phrases that we encounter in budget applications? Budget narrative. This is just going to be telling the written story of your budget. But building a budget, which is just the math of it all, the design of your numbers, essentially. And last but not least, the budget tips and tricks. There are some things that I've noticed that are really important to consider and hope that you walk away with today. And so with that, let's get started. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so far you've been introduced to many acronyms and keywords, many of which can be used interchangeably and oftentimes vary between institutions or organizations that you may work for. Even grant and funding opportunities that you're applying for can use these words interchangeably. The word cloud you see before you are only a handful of words that you may come across in the grant world. These are just ones that I could think of off the top of my head, and just a couple of them, not even all. And they're only going to cover a portion of the words that we'll be using to speak about budget building today. And since the grant world is not exclusive to organizations that are equipped with a team of grant managers and also other people who are experts in all types of funding opportunities, it's really important that you familiarize yourself with the terminology associated with the funding opportunity to which you're applying. And sure, we know what a budget is, but what about when we say something like a modular budget is required versus a detailed budget? What do we do then? When you're going through the requirements for a funding opportunity and you find an acronym or a word that you're familiar with, Google it. It's really helpful to type the word or acronym in, say, Google, and then add grants to the end, just because sometimes you're going to find, words that apply to just general accounting for business. And when you're applying for funding opportunities, when you type in grant, it kind of helps narrow down those searches. And then oftentimes you'll find that there are a ton of resources out there that are specific to your application. NIH has a robust system robust system and application resources that are available to you. You can just go to their website and it will break down every single component of the application. And it's probably about a 400-page document. So it might be a little overwhelming, but it is really easily searched and you can find exactly what you're looking for. So with that being said, let's move on to some basic terminology. And actually, we're going to start with a participation activity. So Edward, if you can please go to the next slide. So let's participate. I'm curious to see which budget terms the group is already familiar with, and also see if there's any varying uses in terminology across people from different organizations. So at this time, if you could please use the chat and type in any words you know that are related to building of a budget. This is an opportunity to type in any words that you associate with the budget or the budget building process, and just an opportunity to see what other words people use from different organizations from yourself. And feel free to be creative. Okay, fringe, allowable, meter, gap, justification, unallowable cost, sad face. Okay, so I'm already seeing some. Modified total direct cost, interesting. MTDC, that's an acronym that some people may not be familiar with. Capital versus operating. These are some really impressive terms. Indirect fringe. So I'm seeing some, overlap in some words and words that also, I don't necessarily use myself. So like I said, I'm seeing a lot of terms come through that are really relevant to this process. And I'm sure there are even some that you guys are mentioning that are new to me that are floating around. And you'll often find that in the grant process with proposals and budget building, that terminology and how we refer to different steps in the process can often differ between individuals. And like I said, even organizations and funding opportunities. So it's really important to know what those terms mean so that you can ensure you're meeting the needs of your funders whenever you come across it in a funding opportunity. So with that being said, let's move on to some specific words that I think are very important to understand when it comes to the budget building process. Next slide. All right, first off, I think it's really important that we talk about scope of work. For this, I think NIH definition really, describes it best. Simply put, the scope of work is the overview of the aims, objectives, and purposes of a grant. Furthermore, it goes on to specify as well as the methodology, approach, analysis, and other activities, and the tools, technologies, and timeframes needed to meet the grant's objectives. All of this together makes up your grant and the grant proposal, but it is very specific when it comes to building your budget. This comes first because for proper budget development, it is critical to consider how each of the funds requested to support the project will contribute to the overall goals and expected outcomes. So essentially, how does the work being done on the grant fit into the aims or objective or the end goal that the funder is hoping to see? It's always important to have the end in mind when you're building your budget. So knowing your project and the outcomes will help you to be able to more clearly communicate the grant's research emphasis, the impact, and progress when the funder asks things or how things are going. So I like to think of this kind of as a transaction. Someone gives you money to meet a goal. They want to make sure that their money is being put to good use so that they have the outcome they were expecting. If you're no longer able to meet that goal or aim as you had originally told them you were going to do it, you definitely want to bring it to their attention. So think of the scope of work as the same thing. If you are going to, take someone's money and say, I'll give you this as the outcome, you're going to want to ask permission if you're going to change that. So usually a change in scope of work on the project requires approval. So just something to keep in mind. You originally, when you apply, may have a certain idea of how things are going to go, and then it may not exactly work out as you had originally intended due to change of personnel, stuff like that. So although this is more of a post-award problem, regardless of the change, it's crucial to know your project. And if you're uncertain about whether or not you are changing the scope, it's always really important to reach out to the sponsor. A great example of this is if travel support is being requested, we need to know what benefit does that travel provide to the project? How does this travel fit into the overall scope of the work being done on the project? We should not be requesting travel if it's unnecessary. Grants are not there to, pay for a luxury trip or go to a really nice conference if the conference doesn't actually contribute to what you're doing with the project. Next slide, please. So cost principles. These are grant management practices that specify that a cost can be charged to a federal award. In the case of federal funding, which is oftentimes what I'm managing, awardees are required to have solid management practices for administering the award and have accounting practices that align with cost principles. Cost principles as defined in the Uniform Guidance, subpart E, we also refer to this as the UGM, specify that a cost can be charged to a federal award only if it is allowable, reasonable, and allocable. In addition, items of cost must be consistently treated by the award recipient. And so we'll be actually breaking these down, all three of the cost principles further in the next few slides, because they are some of the most important basics for creating a budget. All right, next slide, please. Allocable. So these are expenses that are charged to the grant and have to be in proportion to the benefit that is being received by the project. So essentially, allocable means that we are charging a proportionate amount to the grant that is in line with the ratio of work that is being done. For example, if personnel on the grant expects to dedicate 50% of their 40-hour work week to the grant itself or to the project or the work being done on the project, they should only request for a proportionate amount of salary support, so up to 50%. This concept also applies to other aspects of items being purchased for the grant. For example, if you are needing to purchase a laptop for work on the grant and you purchase solely with grant funds, the laptop cannot be used for any other project or purpose, not any administrative work, no sending emails related to scheduling meetings for your normal job duties. It has to be solely dedicated to the work being done towards the project. This would be considered a misuse of grant funds if you were to use it for any other purpose. Alrighty. And next on to allowable, please. Alrighty. Allowable. So allowable, this is likely one of the more difficult concepts as this can vary from grant to grant. However, it's usually best to manage this based off of the federal standards as they are the most common source of funding and have uniform guidance available for reference. And oftentimes we recommend that you manage your grant off the most restrictive practice. So if your university or institution tends to manage funds in a very restrictive way, in a conservative way, and more conservative than the grant that you've received, then you want to go off of your organizations for certain types of opportunities. Now, you are still bound to the restrictions as placed by the entity for which you received the funding. But it is just really important that you familiarize yourself with allowable costs for your grant specifically, as these can vary greatly. For example, with most federal funding, you're not able to purchase food or office supplies. However, there are opportunities like one I managed before called a Simon's Grant, where they were able to purchase pizza and coffee, but this is a really rare instance. And if you hadn't read the terms of your grant, you wouldn't have known that this was an allowable cost. And if you were just basing it off of the federal guidelines, this would not be. And one of the funniest things I've ever seen purchased was I had a faculty member who wanted to buy quill and ink for his research to take his notes. And generally, this would kind of be an unnecessary cost. Why wouldn't we just use regular pens, office supplies that already exist? But under the Simon's Grant, it does facilitate purchasing of whatever the researcher needs to support their work. Alrighty, on to the next slide, please. And actually, Edward, could you go back one more thing really quick? And just one resource that I would like to thank you, Jen, to point out. Jen has posted in the chat. This is NIH's allowability of costs and activities. Even as an experienced grant manager, I reference this all the time. It does break down, specific items, cost items, and whether it would be deemed a direct or indirect cost, which is what we'll go into next. And I reference this probably on a weekly basis, just because there are so many different things that you could be purchasing or see purchased on a daily basis with grants. And if you're managing one grant, it could be easy. If you're managing multiple or creating for yourself, this is going to be a really useful category, or reference document, so that you know how to budget these items and whether it would be deemed an allowable cost. All right, next slide, Edward. Thank you. Alrighty, so some examples of unallowable costs. Entertainment. You can't take your team to the movies or throw a party with catering, unfortunately. That's just not something that you can generally use for grant expenses. Like I said, some of these do have exceptions, and it's really important to know your grants so that you can apply those and use your grant funds to the fullest. Personal expenses, you likely wouldn't pay for your groceries, your own personal groceries, using a company purchasing card. So, I mean, the same rules tend to apply to grants. We just want to make sure we're good stewards of grant funds. And again, with alcohol, this is a pretty common rule, I think, across your employer. Also with grant funds, don't purchase alcohol with it. I think that's going to be safe to say across most grants, unless you're maybe doing a study on the effects of alcohol on the certain population, then it would be a different type of cost. Membership dues. So membership fees are kind of a difficult one. The reason why membership fees are not reimbursable by federal grants is because it's hard to judge the benefit that will have on the project. Oftentimes membership fees are more representative of personal or professional development versus a direct benefit to the grant or the outcome of the project. So oftentimes the conference registration fees can be covered, but the membership fee associated with it can sometimes be difficult to fund. Some additional examples of unallowable costs that would be more inclusive in the indirect category. Costs that include facilities and administration, passport fees and some visa costs, and then proposal costs. Next slide, please. Okay, and the last cost principle that we're going to go over is reasonable. The reasonable costs are likely the most straightforward of the cost principles. Simply put, the amount requested is, if the amount requested is not excessively high and is within the bounds of common sense, it should be considered a reasonable expense. This, I think, mostly contributes to, is dedicated to like the amount, the price. We don't want to be, spending a ton of money on something that we can get for a more reasonable price. So many reference the prudent person test, which is asking the question, would a prudent person pay this particular amount for this same item or service? So whenever you're building your grant, it's really important to ask that of yourself and ask that of the services or the products that you're intending on purchasing and when you're creating that budget. For example, or something to consider, if this were a news article that popped up on your phone, would you be okay with this purchase? This can also be extremely tricky, as many prudent people external to the research community do not have familiarity with the costs associated with particular equipment. But for the sake of your proposal, be sure you can back up your costs with quotes, historical records of prices, wages, etc. The more documentation you have to support your reasoning for putting it on the justification or the document to request the support, the easier it's going to be to get that funded. Alrighty, and next slide, please. Okay, and actually I'll go ahead and take the time to answer Irene's question. It's a really good question. So even if the membership fee allows there to be a reduced rate to a conference, it is still unallowable because it's still paying using, now if you, okay, let me see. Irene, I'll get back to you on your question. I want to read it fully. So a direct cost, sorry, Irene. A direct cost is an expense that can be directly tied to a need for the project. A direct cost can be traced to the cost object, which can be a service, a product, or department. Generally, these are easily identifiable within a specific project. You know it's going to contribute to the work being done in this particular way. Allowable expenses in line with cost principles. Again, the allocable, allowable, and reasonable. We want to make sure that we're following those rules of spending. Direct salaries and wages are an example. Materials and supplies, consultants and subcontracts. These are just a few examples, and we'll touch on these a little bit more here shortly. Next slide, please. And on the other end, opposite of direct costs, we have indirect costs. There are so many different words and acronyms that are synonymous to indirect costs. Examples of this are F&A, which stands for Facilities and Administration, discretionary funds, M&O, which stands for Materials and Operations, overhead, and so many more. There may be even some additional names that your institution or organization uses to refer to indirect costs that I may have not even covered today. So indirect costs are a portion of your total project budget that are reserved for costs associated with the maintenance or operation of a facility or organization that is hosting the project. Some organizations are more equipped for certain projects than others, but may also have a higher rate for things like administrative services to support the work, buildings and equipment, for things that need electricity to operate. These are all indirectly related to supporting the work on the project, but would generally not be deemed a direct cost associated with the outcome of the project or of the work. So these funds are oftentimes referred to as discretionary funds, as they are left to your discretion on how they are to be used. Each project is granted a percentage of the total budget to use at their discretion, and are usually not required to report what those funds are used towards. It's also really important to keep in mind that the IDC rate may or may not count as a part of the award total, depending on your funder. This is another really important reason to thoroughly read the funding announcement, as it's often stated in the call for applications specifically. For some funders, the percentage can be added in addition to the award total maximum. For others, it can only be included as a part of the total amount that the award allows. And so, like I said, indirect costs are not easily charged to one project, and support the institution, facility costs, garbage, general supplies, things that just allow the institution or the organization to operate. Be mindful that some grants do not allow IDC or indirect costs, or may cap the allowed percentage that you can request. And not all institutions have an IDC rate. Some institutions, especially institutes of higher education, already have a federally negotiated percentage that they can utilize. For example, the University of North Texas Health Science Center, we utilize a 48% IDC rate. But for those who do not have one, they are eligible to use the de minimis rate, which is a maximum of 10% of your total direct costs. And we'll get into that a little bit and how to calculate those further. Next slide, please. So in this situation, I wanted to show a great example of a comparison of similar direct and indirect cost categories. This is provided by the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. As you can see on each side, we have similar types of categories: salaries and wages, materials and supplies, and travel, which are three really commonly requested budget items. However, on each side of the chart, these items are deemed to be allowable as direct costs or items that must be reserved for use with IDC on the right. It is also important to keep in mind that your institution may have additional restrictions on what is deemed allowable and allowable expense, as it may be frowned upon for you to use IDC funds to purchase tickets or shows, and as mentioned in this travel category here. So why I wanted to bring up this example is, even though you have salary, wage, and fringe benefits, which is generally a direct cost, there are instances where you would have to use it, label it as an indirect cost. Same thing for materials and supplies. Pens, pencils, paper, staples, these should be something that are overhead costs that are provided by your organization or institution. However, there are materials and supplies like gloves or scientific supplies that may be specific and used towards your research directly that wouldn't necessarily be, provided as a means of operation for the organization that you work with. With travel, this is kind of a silly example. I think most places generally don't allow you to use their funds for cost of entertainment, like tickets to shows or sports events. But then again, if you work for one of those organizations, good for you. I would love to use our funds to go on a little trip here. Okay. Next slide, please. So some examples of IDC calculations. We're going to go through a couple here in just a moment over the course of the next two slides. But for the sake of ease, we're going to use the de minimis IDC rate, which as a reminder is 10%. But please remember that the de minimis rate is only available for organizations to use if they do not have a federally negotiated rate. And just another reminder, many people often make the mistake of basing their IDC calculation off of the total amount of the award that's available. So for example, if you have a $25,000 award, they're basing that 10% off of $25,000 versus the total amount of support that they're requesting. And we'll go over that in just a few minutes. Alrighty, Edward, if you can go on to the next slide for our first example. And I'll just give you guys a little bit of time if you want to try these calculations yourself. So for example, number one, if your award is for up to $10,000 in total costs, total project costs, how much IDC could you request indirect? Could you request using a 10% de minimis rate with $9,000 in direct costs? What is your final budget total after that? feel free to put your answers in the chat if you're feeling brave. If not, I'll just tell you the answers in just a moment, but I'll give you guys just a second to do the math. So just a reminder, don't base your IDC off of the total cost that you're allowed. That's just going to be up to. Alrighty, so the answer here, nice try, Thompson. So the answer here would be 9,900 is the final budget total. Good job, Bridget. The reason for that is with a 10% de minimis rate on 9,000 that we're basing off of the direct costs, that would be $900 in IDC that we can request. So 9,000 times 10% would be $900. And then we add those two together. So your $900 in IDC is the first answer, and then 9,900 on the second answer. Alrighty, Edward, can we go on to the next slide where we're going to have example number 2, so we can give it another try. If you have a $20,000 award, and just keep in mind the IDC percent does change here, with a 50% federally negotiated IDC rate and request $13,000 in direct support, how much IDC support will you request? And just give y'all another minute, just kind of think that through. Awesome, Carol, great job. All right, so the amount of IDC requested with a 50% IDC rate on $13,000 is $6,500. So we just do half of 13,000 or 50% of 13,000, where we get the $6,500 in IDC or indirect costs. Our final budget total will be the direct costs plus the calculated indirect costs. So 13,000 our direct costs plus 6,500, 50% of that, which is our IDC rate, which totals out to be 19,500. And so just keep in mind, these are some relatively straightforward scenarios, and some examples of calculating our IDC. We have to take into consideration things like modified total direct costs, whether or not there are subawards involved, and these have additional rules that must be included in the calculations in order to properly determine the total budget. We won't have time to get into those today, but I highly recommend learning if you ever anticipate having projects with multiple subaward partnerships or collaborations. Also, if you have further questions about that and you want to, talk it out further, please feel free to email me or contact me directly. I'd be happy to walk you through some of those scenarios and the rules associated with them. All right, Edward, next slide, please. All right, so budget narrative. This is going to be a really important part of any grant application that you are going to be submitting. This is going to partner any budget detail that you're submitting as well. The budget detail is just generally the Excel spreadsheet or the chart that shows you the numbers, versus the budget narrative. This is going to be more of the written statement of why you need, or what you need and why you need it. Next slide, please. So the budget narrative, and as I already stated, is also referred to often as the budget justification. This is an extremely important part of having a successful proposal. The justification provides the applicant with the opportunity to show a clear understanding of how the anticipated requested costs will support the aims or the outcomes expected on the project. Properly constructed justification is both detailed and concise, while also ensuring that the reviewer has a fully painted, encompassing picture of your financial needs for the project. Also, it's really important to note that just because you put it in your budget narrative does not mean that your funder will approve it. However, if you're able to frame the need in a light of its importance to the project, it's more likely to remain at the award stage. Many funders will oftentimes request clarification into the details that are provided in your budget justification. So this is where we would reference back to those cost principles. Be prepared to explain or expand upon any request for funding support that you put in your application, why it is needed, and if there are any questions or concerns that the funder may have on the allowability, the allocability, or reasonability. This is just your opportunity to provide a very thorough explanation of how the cost will be used towards the project objectives, and provide any clarification on figures that may be kind of ambiguous on the budget spreadsheet, because like I said, they're going to go hand in hand when it comes down to your proposal. Next slide, please. All right, so some common budget categories that you're going to see. This is by no means all of them. Just some of the more frequent ones that I come across. We have salary and wages, just, who and what is doing the work, or what kind of work are we doing on the project. Fringe benefits, those are going to be varying from organization. A lot of these I'll touch on here in a moment. Equipment, travel, materials and supplies, publication, consultant costs, indirect costs, subcontracts. The list goes on and on. Like I said, refer to that link that Jen posted earlier, the allowability of costs and activities. There are so many different costs that you can include. And it should also tell you whether it's an allowable cost, a direct cost, indirect cost. Thank you, Jen. That way you have that for future reference. I have it saved in my the links on my folder, and I reference it, like I said, on a daily basis. It is invaluable. All right, next slide, please. So what we're going to do now is try and build just a really basic budget together, just to kind of give you an idea of, what the verbiage should look like whenever you're building a justification, how to calculate that IDC on multiple different categories, and then we can see if you all kind of follow along. So I'll just ask that if you have a piece of pen and paper with you, just to, after every other slide, I'll give you some numbers, and then see if you can keep a running total, and then we'll see if you can calculate the IDC at the very end if we end up on the same page. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so first off, some things that we need to consider when we are starting the budget building process. What is the maximum amount of funds that I'm able to apply for? Like I said earlier, a lot of times you want to make sure that you are basing your budget off of knowing what the maximum amount is that you have available. Not everyone's going to utilize or need all those funds, but just something to keep in mind. In addition, what is the budget period I'm budgeting for? Some grants will, last 1 year, some grants last 10 years. So it's really important, do you have the manpower? Do you have the infrastructure to budget for this, the escalation in prices, things like that? It's just something to consider, especially when you start getting into budget periods that last for a long period of time. Are there any restrictions associated with this opportunity? Some grants will not fund certain types of cost categories. Some grants restrict travel. Just something to keep in mind when you're reading that funding announcement or call for applications. And would I be able to do this project with the funds being offered? If the grant is only $10,000 and you need $25,000 to do the project, it may not be the grant for you. Now, if it may be something to consider applying for if you have other sources of funding that can, contribute, but also you still have to manage to pitch that so that your funder thinks you can, you can successfully show the funder that you're able to do the work with the funds being offered. All right, next slide, please. So our first category that we're going to go over are salaries and wages. We're going to start here because in order to have a project, you usually have to have people to see it through and work on it. So once you have assigned roles and an idea of expectations for personnel, it can be easier to decide what else will be needed in other categories for the project to be completed. Salaries and wages are broken down into categories that describe and justify the personnel information for each position being budgeted for. And this is done by providing a brief description of each individual appointee's roles and responsibilities towards the project. Oftentimes the budget narrative, depending on the sponsor, make sure to check your FOA. You're going to hear that a million more times from me, will require the name, degree qualifications if there are any, and title, their role on the project, their dedicated time commitment, and an elaborate description of the duties and roles they plan in relation to the project goals and objectives. So here you can see we have kind of a hierarchy. You have senior and key personnel and other personnel. You'll often hear the term PI, which is primary investigator, which means the head contact person or the director of the project. And then you're going to want to describe how each person will fit into that. Something really important to consider is percent effort to calendar months. This is kind of where we were talking about the allocability of your budgeting here, where if 50% of their salary is paid by, let's say, a state fund and 50% by the grant, then only 50% of their effort can be dedicated, or excuse me, 50% of their salary can be covered by this grant. Again, be mindful of requirements from some sponsors, such as salary caps or minimum effort. Salary caps for NIH, they do have a 199,000 salary cap, excuse me, 199,000 salary cap. And then for some institutions, they have a minimum effort for which you can use when you apply. Next slide, please. All right, so our first example in the running total, so it's going to be 50,000. This is pulled directly from an example of a budget justification from NIH. In this instance, we know that Dr. Jane Doe will be lead on the project as designated by the principal investigator. This is usually, like I said, called a PI. After doing some research on their salary within our institution, we have found out that Dr. Jane Doe has an annual salary of $100,000. At 50%, however, we must properly allocate their salary to 50% or 6 months as she will be working on this project throughout the year. It would not be appropriate for or allowable for them to make the grant pay more than 50% of the work they are doing towards other projects. So converting percent effort to calorie months can be a little bit tricky. It's just making sure that it is proportionate to the work being done. So in this instance, we would budget $50,000 for Dr. Jane Doe's salary, but don't forget that we must also consider IDC on top of this, but we'll revisit that once we have more numbers to work with. Next slide, please. So your first number is going to be 50,000 to write down. Okay, for fringe benefits. Fringe benefits are allowances, services, and programs that are provided by employers as compensation in addition to their regular wages and salary. Fringe can be a bit tricky as rates and policies, can vary from organization to organization. And some examples of fringe, and there are plenty more, are sick leave, vacation leave, insurance, retirement, pension plans, unemployment, tuition benefit or reimbursement programs, and so many others. But because of those variances, you're often going to find different percentages. And at the proposal stage, it can be tricky to know off the top of your head what someone's specific election is for their insurance without asking them for more information. So most institutions or organizations have a standard rate that they suggest you using at the proposal stage to ensure that there's enough coverage for whenever you get the award. You would much rather have more fringe support than not enough fringe support because that would dip into other areas of your budget. So at UNTHSC, for example, we have standard rates that are used for grant proposals across the board. And for the sake of our next example, I'm going to go ahead and use those figures. But please note that these are specific to my university and yours will likely be very different. All right, next slide, please. Okie dokie. Fringe benefits. We have 23% faculty, 33% for staff, and 8.65. And so you can see it varies between people. In this instance, we're going to be assuming that Dr. Doe is a faculty member at the university, and according to our published rates, means that their fringe benefit is going to be calculated at 23% off of their requested salary report or salary support. So for Dr. Doe, we're going to be taking the $50,000 requested salary support, multiplying that by the 23%. And so this is going to be how much we're going to need to request for the estimated fringe, $11,500. And so if the variable were 33 or 8.65, it would obviously change our numbers. And you just need to make sure that you're mindful of people's different categories whenever they are, building their budget. Okay. So next one is going to be 11,500 and travel. So there are many instances where collaboration is needed in order to meet the objectives or aims of a project. Travel is often used as means to connect people and ideas that are necessary and crucial for different realms of research. It's really important to note that different types of grants will have differing policies in regard to travel. So it's really important that you check on that. Some will allow it, some will not. Some will permit domestic travel, but restrict international. And again, this is where your funding announcement will be your best friend. And then again, also, with COVID times, it's really important to ensure that you are checking on that within your institution, as many are restricting travel, even for grant programs as well. There are things like federally issued per diem rates, so you're restricted to those. It's really hard to distinguish those at the time of creating your budget. So whenever you're doing your justification, just try and be as specific as you can. But obviously with travel, it may be some looser requests, and we'll go on to the next slide and we can look at an example. So again, if you have specific details, it's best to provide them. When you have the location for travel opportunities available, you can provide estimates for things such as round trip costs, per diem rates in that city, lodging rates, etc. But for this example, Dr. Doe requests $6,000 total for domestic travel support for 3 trips to professional conferences to present research findings associated with the project. $2,000 is requested for each trip to various locations that are to be determined. And so with this, we are still stating the need, why it's necessary, what it's contributing to the overall outcome of the project. And so we don't have the specific information, but we're still providing the reviewer with information as to why this is necessary, which is a really important aspect if you don't have those specific details. All right. So for this one, we're going to put down $6,000 as our net direct cost. All right, next slide, please. And with other direct costs, these are just some additional categories that may fall under an other direct costs. This is just a more broad overreaching or overarching category where you'll find different things that doesn't have a standard budget category. Next slide, please. So this one's a little bit more overwhelming just because it is broken down into many subcategories. So example, materials and supplies is a really common one. And this is just going to be where you break down, into separate cost categories, the needs for your project, publication costs, shipping costs. I saw that someone had put that here. This would generally be, as long as it's justifiable and contributes to the need associated with the project, this is where you would put those postage and shipping. I know that Julia had asked, and I haven't gotten to look at it specifically, $1,000 requested for postage and shipping, charges required to send samples to partners and labs for further testing and analysis. So postage and shipping are oftentimes referred to as an indirect cost, but if you can show that there's a direct need and a direct application of it to the project and the need for the project, it will be then deemed a direct cost. So this is something where, depending on how you frame your requests for funding support, depends on how it will be categorized as direct or indirect. Alrighty. So we have 5,000, 3,000, 1,000, 1,000, which totals up to 10,000 lastly in our last direct category. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is our direct cost right now? The total direct costs, just direct. All right, anyone else really quick? Okay, Kate got it. Great job, Kate. Awesome to see that people are keeping up. So in Budget Building 102, it would be worth learning about modified total direct costs. These come into play whenever there are charges that aren't eligible to be considered for IDC. And so we're going to have to skip that today and maybe in Budget Building 102. And next slide, please. So we have 77,500 in total direct costs. Next slide. And don't forget about the IDC. So remember that we're using a 10% de minimis rate, and the calculation is going to be based off the total direct costs. Next slide, please. All right, so bear with me now. Let's total them together. See what you all come up with, and then you're just gonna, if you have the answer, give me the, there we go. All right, next slide, please. Alrighty, so I do see a couple of right answers in the chat. So essentially we have 77,500 in total direct costs. Reminder that we had a 10% de minimis rate for this. And so we would be basing that off, using that to calculate our indirect costs. So $77,500 times 0.10 equals 7,750 in indirect costs. So this is what our indirect cost support would be. And when we total those together, we get $85,250 in total requested project support. So awesome to you all in the chat. Great job. All right, next slide. We're almost done. Bear with me. And so lastly, some tips and things to consider, some quick points for me as a grant manager, just things I've noticed over the course of my career that I have found useful and want you to take away with you today. Next slide, please.
I said, you call here and what picks up?
All right, so number one, budgets have a lot of room for discretion and interpretation. There's verbiage that you can use that will allow you to more loosely interpret the budget narrative and justification if you're given an award. Use terms and phrases like up to or other costs as needed for the project so that you can further justify the expenses as you need them and you're not restricting yourself. I think that's a great transition into the second point. Don't restrict yourself by being too specific on the justification. A great example of this is when people name specific vendors for obtaining items that can be purchased from a variety of sources. When you name a vendor, you could potentially be restricting yourself. Also, naming specific vendors can potentially have or can be potentially deemed a conflict of interest. That's a rare circumstance, but it is possible. And sometimes we have to name specific vendors. This is very common in scientific research with purchasing, things like certain types of animals that contain certain genetic makeups or scientific qualities. And it's, limited to a very niche field of people in the scientific community. But you don't have to name vendors oftentimes unless it's for a very specific purpose. Number 3, use the internet as a resource. Google is my best friend. I cannot emphasize this enough. There's so much gray area in grant management that it's important to use legitimate resources on the internet that are available to you. And I find it extremely helpful to see how other institutions have handled my question or concern. Also finding resources that pertain to a specific funding announcement or, a reminder of various budget categories, or even find updated policies on grant management as it's always changing. Number 4, don't be afraid to ask for help. Many funders have helplines or emails that are available to answer your questions. Applications for some federal departments have a awesome help system that will put you in touch with a live person who opens a ticket for you and will address your concern. And then oftentimes many people have that same question, or even if there's something wrong with the system, you bring it up, they get it fixed, and they had no idea until you gave them a call. And then the last 2, these kind of go hand in hand. Your budget justification narrative should be a story of your budget. You and the reviewer should each be able to take a passage of the budget narrative and translate that into numbers that match your budget details. And then once you've done that successfully, see if someone else is able to translate your narrative into a matching budget as well. This can help clarify questions that other people may have with the way you've worded the document. So, use the people around you, because if they can understand it, then it's likely that your reviewer will understand it. And next slide, please. And last but not least, budgets can be tricky, so do not be afraid to ask questions. I want to make myself available to you all. Please feel free to reach out to me after this at any time. The Region 3 Library of Medical Library, it wants to be a resource for you guys for any applications that you have for our region. We're really excited to see the next round of applicants. So hopefully this gave you some takeaway tips, and I will pass it on to Edward.
Thank you, Christy. As Jan mentioned earlier, we want to make sure we ask colleagues or partners to review our application before applying. Having a peer review the proposal helps catch errors and make sure enough detail is included. Did they understand what the project is and why is it important? As the grant writer, you know everything about the project and might make some assumptions. Having another outside reader can help catch any missing information, any spelling or grammatical errors, and also assure that the proposal makes sense. Reviewers have to review a lot, and having things written well and explained well helps with the process. Every reviewer sees things differently and often comes from a different background. The most common mistakes that we see are individuals ignoring the instructions in the RFP. For example, this could be applying for the grant that doesn't fit your project scope of work. Please read the RFP carefully, and if you have questions, contact us or the office that's hosting the grant. We are here to answer any questions you may have. No project plan or logic model to discuss the life cycle of the grant. As a reviewer, it is nice to see the things you plan to fulfill. Overuse or forced use of buzzwords. However, you do want to reference the language in the RFP. I've had the chance to review some proposals, and I was surprised to find some that I read full of spelling and grammatical errors or poor writing. This makes the reviewer wonder if the applicant is capable of carrying out a legitimate project if they are not able to submit a proposal that is mostly without errors. The best way to catch for errors is having someone to review your proposal and using software to catch grammatical errors. Grammarly is a good resource to catch grammatical errors. The budget cannot be relied on to tell your full story or program plan. We want you to tell your story, but the budget session is only for budgeting. Tell us how you plan to spend the money and refer to the budget portion of this webinar as a resource. Christy did an excellent job explaining the budget. One time we submitted a proposal and it was bounced back to us. The reviewers didn't know what the acronyms for my field meant. Even though your work jargon makes complete sense to you, it may not be to a reviewer who may be in a different field. So you want to make sure that you explain those acronyms and list everything out in your proposal. Early in the webinar, Margie mentioned 508 compliance. But what is 508 compliance and why does accessibility matter? Why does accessibility matter? If we look at accessibility on a worldwide scale, we will see that over 1 billion people live with some form of disability. The number of people with disabilities are dramatically increasing. This is due to demographic trends and increase in chronic health conditions, among other causes. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability. The percentage of people living with disabilities is the highest in the South. Almost everyone is likely to experience some form of disability, temporarily or permanently, at some point in life. In 1998, Congress amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to require federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. The law applies to all federal agencies when they develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology. Under Section 508, agency must give disabled employees and members of the public access to information comparable to the access available to others. 508 compliance is important when it comes to identifying web accessibility and disabilities such as auditory, cognitive, learning, neurological, physical, and visual. Auditory disabilities are a condition affecting the ability to understand speech. Some people with auditory disability can hear sounds, but sometimes not sufficiently to understand all speech, especially when there is background noise. This can include people with hearing aids. Examples of barriers for people with auditory disabilities are audio content, such as videos with voices and sounds without captions or transcripts, media players that do not provide options to adjust the text size and colors for captions, lack of sign language to supplement important information in text that is difficult to read. For some people with auditory disabilities, sign language is the primary language, and they may not read the written language as fluently. Providing important information in sign language and using simple text that is supplemented by images, graphs, and other illustrations help make web content more understandable to many people. However, it is important to remember that not all people with auditory disability know sign language. Cognitive, learning, and neurological disabilities involve neurodiversity and neurological disorders, as well as behavioral and mental health disorders that are not necessarily neurological. Examples of barriers for people with cognitive, learning, and neurological are long passages of text without images, graphs, or other illustrations to highlight the context, web pages that are difficult to navigate, web browsers and media players that do not provide mechanisms to suppress animation and audio. Physical disability is a condition that limits one or more basic physical activities in life. Examples of barriers for people with physical disabilities are missing visual and non-visual orientation cues, page structure and other navigational aids, insufficient time limits to respond to or complete tasks such as to fill out an online form, inconsistent, unpredictable, and overly complicated navigation mechanism and page functions. Visual disability is a condition when an individual loses part or all of their ability to see. Examples of barriers for people with visual disabilities are websites, web browsers, and authoring tools that do not support the use of custom color combinations, text, images, and page layouts that cannot be resized or that lose information when resized, websites, web browsers, and authoring tools that do not provide full keyboard support. There are resources available that can assist you with 508 compliance. Section 508.gov provides guidance to federal agency staff who play a role in IT accessibility. The site addresses several key topics, including policy and management, acquisition, and content creation. Digital.gov mission is to transform how government learns, builds, delivers, and measures digital services. They do this by providing people in the federal government with the tools, methods, and practices and policy guidance they need to deliver effective and accessible digital services. In November, our team took a plain language training from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and it changed how I will forever view documents. Plainlanguage.gov goal is to promote the use of plain language for all government communities. They believe that using plain language will save federal agency time and money and provide better services to the public. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. It's been a pleasure to teach this course with Christy Ingram, Jen Ortiz, and Margie Shepard.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.